What if I told you these ridiculous ads
Did you say I'll feel better smoking Philip Morris?
Yes, you'll feel better.
are not all that different from these ads?
Now, every box of Kellogg's Rice Krispies cereal has antioxidants and nutrients that help support your child's immune system.
Are the foods slowly poisoning us? And do companies know about that? Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome to my channel where I review and debunk nutritional misinformation online. Thanks for sending this video that is suggesting that we're being poisoned by the food that America makes and that the companies know about it. So what does one do about that? And be sure to listen to the end where you get my final thoughts. Before we jump into today's video, I would like to invite you to join my free course, Start Keto Right. If you're ready to lose weight, boost your energy, and get real results, this science-backed method will help you every step of the way. No guesswork, just a proven method to help you succeed on keto faster and feel amazing. Sign up through the link in the description.
What if I told you these ridiculous ads
Did you say I'll feel better smoking Philip Morris?
Yes, you'll feel better.
are not all that different from these ads?
Now, every box of Kellogg's Rice Krispies cereal has antioxidants and nutrients that help support your child's immune system.
Wow, I didn't know that Rice Krispies is being advertised to support immunity without the other kind of consequences of having Rice Krispies. Wow. Advertising for tobacco was common when I was growing up, 60s and 70s. I don't recall exactly when the public health world got upset and said, tobacco industry, you can't advertise anymore on TV and then on billboards. And so, because we knew that if someone saw a cigarette, they would want to smoke. And it was that addictive. So, you know, out of sight, out of mind. And it probably helped a lot of people to quit and not to smoke at the time. So now we're faced with similar kinds of advertising for the food and the highly processed, ultra processed food. In this video, always consider the source. I think this is just taking information and knitting it into a narrative that the industries are basically using advertising to promote foods that are not healthy for us. Let's see what the evidence for that is.
For decades, massive food conglomerates like Kraft and Kellogg's have made over $1 trillion through the manipulation of food science and food scientists, and ultimately, us. And their goal is much like big tobaccos, to do and say whatever they can to get people to buy their product over and over and over again until their product is no longer a want, but a need.
To whose advantage is it to keep the public confused about what to eat? Well, obviously, it's the food industry's advantage.
Ultra-processed foods make up over half of the American diet, and do so with little scrutiny from health experts or government officials. And the food industry is terrified. Even if Americans skip one ultra-processed snack or meal a day, sales would plummet by 7%.
That's a statistic that I didn't know. That if 50% of the food consumption is ultra-processed food, wow, I didn't know it was that high. And we need statistics and look beyond our own sphere of influence, because that's not what I do. And so we need to have statistics like that. That's a lot, 50%.
Every 5 years, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee meets to review the relevant research and give the American public advice about the latest nutrition science, a process food conglomerates are attempting to sabotage as we speak.
I mean, in every possible way in which they can use their money and political power to encourage people to think their products are good and are willing to help them sell their products, they're going to do that.
The evidence is grim.
That's Marion Nestle, who has written books for decades now on how the food industry, highly processed food, is a health problem, and the industry is something that needs to be reined in. And it's good that she's still giving that information out and being interviewed for this, reacts on this video.
Ultra-processed foods are being linked in study after study to things like heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. researchers are beginning to understand that many of them are functionally addictive. So who will win in this battle between big food and science? We set out to investigate, and in the process learn the disturbing truth about how big tobacco's lies continue to make Americans sick.
When you change to Philip Morris, you'll feel better.
So what exactly are ultra-processed foods? We asked molecular biologist and nutritionist Mary Nessel.
These are foods that are industrially produced. They require machinery and they require ingredients that you don't have access to. So industrially produced, designed to be irresistibly delicious. That's their purpose. Corn on the cob is unprocessed. Canned corn, frozen corn are processed. Doritos are ultra processed.
So we've been exploring how do you define ultra processed, and if the difference in a corn in a can or frozen is processed, and yet you have your own corn and you're taking the corn on the cob, you're looking at the effect on the blood glucose, it's going to be the same. So there's some use of the term ultra processed that is not really going to be clinically relevant. So I wouldn't want you to have the corn even when it's on the cob if you're trying to do a low carb diet and be in ketosis. On a carnivore diet, you wouldn't have the corn at all. But we're seeing now that there's some difficulty in implementing the concept of ultra-processed food here.
It's not just junk food, to be clear. Many breakfast cereals, granola, and protein bars, diet foods, frozen dinners, sauces, and yogurt fit the ultra-processed label and are implicated in causing disease.
A few years ago, I was writing about salt. And I went to the biggest companies and said, look, salt has become like this public enemy #1 because of its links to heart disease. And why aren't you like cutting back on your use of salt? And Kellogg's, said to me, hey, come on in. We'll show you.
That's Michael Moss, journalist and author of Hooked, a book about how food giants exploit our addictions.
I would put some saltless cornflakes in the bowl. I didn't even know cornflakes had salt, but they do. But these saltless cornflakes went in our bowl. We put some milk on it, took a bite. And before I could say anything, the chief spokeswoman for Kellogg's was sitting there with me, and she gets this look of horror on her face, and she swallows and she blurts out, metal, I taste metal, M-E-T-A-L. And I was kind of thinking the same thing, which was one of my fillings had come out and was sloshing around. And the chief technical officer sitting in her too, and he's kind of in charge of all things scientific, he laughs and he goes, not all people will taste that, but one of the beautiful things about salt for us is that it will cover up some of the off notes, bad taste, that are inherent to kind of the manufacturing process. And so the reason you see so much salt, sugar, fat, and others that are problematic ingredients in these products is that the companies are using those ingredients as part of the industrial process for the manufacturing, for the shelf life, things you don't need to worry about as a home cook.
Michael Moss also wrote the book Salt, Sugar, Fat. You heard him use those 3 terms, where companies try to find the bliss point or the combination of these 3 factors so that you can't stop eating it. And that's why if you come across a highly processed food, you just can't stop eating it. It's been scientifically engineered, I'm sure with focus groups abound, to make it so that you can't stop eating it and you'll go to the whole package, which is kind of the definition of a trigger food, even in the low carb context. If you find that there's a product in a bag or a box and you open it and you eat until it's all gone, you can't meter it, can't moderate it. That's what a trigger food is. Nuts are a very common trigger food that we advise against if you're trying to start out on a low carb, keto, carnivore diet, because nuts are a trigger food for most people and you can't stop eating them. So interesting, Michael Moss here kind of is a whistleblower about the industry, and here learned that the salt masks the off flavor, off notes that I've heard notes being used with wine tasting classes. So you want to cover up or mask the ultra processed food taste. I recommend the Hooked book and Salt, Sugar, Fat book by Michael Moss. If you have any concern or you're skeptical about the idea of food addiction, sugar addiction, ultra-processed food addiction, and the fact that scientists have been together working for companies to try to make foods that you can't stop eating. It's pretty much all in those two books.
While our food environment is saturated with the salty and sugary goodness of ultra-processed food, something else is happening. We are constantly bombarded with nutritional advice about how to stay healthy, what foods can ward off cancer or diabetes, and which ones are slowly killing us. And these two realities are actually deeply related. Let's go back to 2015, when Kraft successfully marketed their singles, which cannot legally be called cheese, as a health food.
Kraft American Singles have double the calcium of many other American slices, plus vitamin D to help grow strong bones.
In 2015, Kraft teamed up with the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, it's a professional group of nutritionists and dietitians, in a campaign called Kids Eat Right.
Well, what if a company wants the positive PR of going healthy, but doesn't want the hassle of actually improving their product? Well, there's a solution for them too.
We do want to move now to a new Kids Eat Right label that will soon be appearing on Kraft singles.
One of the things that food companies do is they partner with health organizations, the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And the idea is if you can donate to those organizations and support those organizations, then the organizations will thank you on their products. And they will say, you know, a partner of or whatever, and this makes it look like it's an endorsement of the products.
As researchers begin to understand the real effects of ultra-processed food on our health, food companies continue to exhaust every option to make sure the science of their foods doesn't hurt their bottom line.
But you know, I don't think the singles are so bad metabolically. And that's, again, one of the differences with how do you define ultra-processed? Do you throw out foods that actually might be ultra-processed but don't have a metabolic effect immediately? Okay, maybe there's a long-term effect, but that's a bit of conjecture and prediction that may or may not be true. So I'd rather have my child eat a Kraft single than a bowl of sugary cereal. So often we're talking about trade-offs here. If you just use the term ultra-processed, it was touched by a machine and all that, you wouldn't have the cheeses here. You wouldn't have a lot of the cheeses because they're processed, and that would be a big dent in the food supply when I think a better focus is cutting out sugar and starch.
Sound familiar?
Tobacco companies had a big problem, more than 50, 70 years ago. There was research coming out that linked cigarette smoking to lung cancer. So the first thing they did was to cast doubt on the research. Not enough people in the trial, wasn't adequately controlled, could have been due to other problems.
When it comes to ultra-processed food, the industry is stacking panels and writing op-eds doing just that. Ultra-processed foods are too broad a category, they say. People might accidentally forego a healthy food that fits the bill. And listen, there's good scientific questions around the ultra-processed label, fringe cases and exceptions to the rule, for instance. But food companies aren't trying to further the science, they're trying to torpedo it.
So, number one, cast doubt on the research. Number two, cast doubt on the researchers. Then you buy your own researchers. You recruit researchers to do their own studies, and you give them a lot of money to do that.
And here lies the tactic behind not just the fight over ultra-processed food, but all of the confusing nutritional advice we get exposed to through the media. Is the problem with childhood nutrition that they don't receive enough vitamin D or calcium? Kraft sure thinks so. Is exercise more important than diet for weight loss? I sure don't know, but Coca-Cola funded a bunch of studies that say so, just in case you thought about cutting back on soda. Food companies and their trade associations literally flood the academic space with money. Ever heard that people who eat breakfast are healthier than those that don't? Those were studies sponsored by Kellogg's and other breakfast food manufacturers.
It's the food industry's advantage to keep the public confused.
We can actually quantify how corrupt funding from corporations and trade groups can be. One review looked at industry-funded studies and found that 60% showed results favorable to the sponsor. That doesn't seem so bad, except that only 3% came to an unfavorable conclusion.
Yeah, so always consider who funds the study, and you always want a replication of the research, the hallmark of science is the replication of the finding. So if you see a result, you want to say that's interesting, let's see if it's reproduced and replicable. You have to kind of imagine that walking around, seeing people carrying the extra food that they've purchased on their bodies in the form of food storage, well, that's called obesity. And the consumption of these foods, if you can't moderate it, is that addiction? I spent 10 years in the smoking cessation, tobacco and nicotine addiction world. And if you can't moderate it, we could call it a trigger food, or you have a sweet tooth, or we could call it for what it is. There's sugar addiction, ultra-processed food addiction. I think more specifically it's sugars and starches, but you're going to hear the language in many different ways. But let's say you had a randomized trial of this group has to cut out ultra-processed food, this doesn't have ultra-processed food cut out, and let's see how they do. I haven't seen that study done. So the implementation of a term could mean something scientifically, but then might be meaningless or ambiguous to a group of individuals who are trying to play out, well, I'm avoiding ultra-processed food. And you're going to get bizarre things like people making their own mashed potatoes at home rather than having instant mashed potatoes, because it's not ultra-processed if you do it at home on your own. So that is a problem that's been worked out by low-carb researchers and low-carb science, that if you instruct people on a method of lowering carbohydrates and you give them instruction, pretty much over and over and over, people lose weight, you reverse diabetes, a lot of health issues get better. Those studies now have been done all around the world. There's a textbook called Ketogenic, The Science Behind Carbohydrate Restriction, that was published in 2003. And so I'm kind of needling, pushing, nudging. If you're going to say you want to reduce ultra-processed food, we need data on what happens if you tell people to reduce their ultra-processed food. What happens if you say that to the industry? What are they going to do? Come up with a new type? Well, we now see keto junk foods, and there's a movie called Dirty Keto where it's kind of showing that a lot of these keto products are not necessarily healthy for you, and yet somehow the industry got word that they should do something called keto. And so every one of these steps requires some sort of organized study or pilot studies at least before a general proclamation for the US to make a change. I mean, that's what happened with the low-fat diet. There's one size fits all. What will happen? What if you said no ultra-processed food? We really have no idea how that would play out yet.
The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee should, in theory, cut through all of that noise and give the American public good scientific information so that they can make their own decisions. But 9 of the 20 members of the committee had some conflict of interest with food, pharmaceutical, or weight loss companies.
The food industry doesn't want any suggestion in dietary guidelines of eating less of their products. It's really simple.
Remember those oddly similar ads we played a few minutes ago? It turns out that some of the biggest food companies were owned by tobacco companies until the mid-2000s. Philip Morris owned Kraft and General Foods. R.J. Reynolds owned Nabisco, until Philip Morris eventually bought that too. So it's no wonder why the same misinformation playbook is being used. What I really wanted to know was, how far do the similarities go? Did the execs at Philip Morris coach Kraft on how to hide the health consequences of their products? Did they go even further and actively try to get people hooked on their products?
My name is Tara Fazzino. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Kansas. For a number of years now, I've studied what are called hyperpalatable foods, and they have combinations of nutrients that typically don't occur in nature, and so they tend to be really rewarding to consume in kind of an unnatural way. So we may find ourselves like continuing to eat these foods even though like we're getting physiological signals telling us, oh, please stop, we've had enough.
So peanut butter, which is almost all fat, is not hyperpalatable, but if you add the right amount of salt or sugar, it is. Like if this jar had a bunch of added sodium, or we had a Reese's peanut butter cup.
We can did some analyses and found that the foods that were produced by tobacco-owned food companies were 29% more likely to be classified as being hyperpalatable foods relative to the same types of foods that were sold during the same period of time by companies that were not tobacco-owned.
Michael Moss described to me the moment during his research when his perspective on the addictive nature of these foods flipped. It took place during a meeting with a former Philip Morris lawyer.
Steve Parrish, the general counsel, we were sitting and chatting. He said to me, you know, Michael, I'm one of those lucky people who could smoke one cigarette a day, put the pack away and not have any compulsion to pull it out again until the next business meeting or the next day or whatever. But I couldn't go near a bag of our Oreo cookies for fear of losing control and eating half the bag in one setting. And it was like so revealing to me because it reinforced to me that they know. I mean, the heads of these companies don't eat their own products.
Very interesting. I remember when I first came to Durham, there was a tobacco warehouse downtown, and some of the patients that I saw worked in the tobacco warehouse, and they were given cigarettes after they left their work job. One of the fellows swept up the tobacco off the floor, and at the time told me that they put that in the chewing tobacco, and that he was never going to use chewing tobacco. So often the people who work the companies know the detail of how the product is made and end up not having it. So here Michael Moss is basically saying the counsel for the company knew that he couldn't open an Oreo for fear of eating the whole thing and then losing control. And so if it's true that the companies know and they're making money from it and causing harm, then there's probably some culpability there. There is back in the day, I remember the tobacco industry, the CEOs were hauled in front of the Congress, and they all basically said that they didn't think tobacco was addictive, and that hit the news and all that. It is almost as if that has to be replicated now for the foods that have been made. Somehow there needs to be some legal action or legal change to make change. I don't know that. I'm not a legal expert, but having seen what the government did to rein in tobacco, when I was in the tobacco research area, the prevalence was 35% nationally in the 90s. And now it's about 11 or 12%, depending on what population you study. And that you go to other countries and the prevalence of smoking is still pretty high. So the US government has had success in reducing the corporate production of addictive substances, and maybe that needs to be considered here. I don't know.
While the tobacco industry got out of the food business for the most part in the 2000s, other companies took a lesson from their success in selling these addictive foods.
They accounted for roughly 50% of the food supply in '88. And by 2018, they were, almost 69% of the food supply. So we had like a 14 percentage point increase, which was pretty dramatic. The non-tobacco owned food companies absorbed the successes of the tobacco-based food companies in the market and reformulated to keep up.
As someone who studies addiction, I think a lot of the rhetoric is, well, if you open a sleeve of Oreos and eat the whole thing, it's on you. It's your lack of self-control. I mean, what is your sort of take on that?
I think that narrative serves the food companies and not us as people. These foods are designed this way, and they maximize, they can maximize company profits.
These are the current stakes for the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. What will the federal government come out and tell the American public about the health effects of ultra-processed foods? The Food and Beverage Issue Alliance, a mega trade group of other trade groups like the Sugar Association and the American Beverage Association, have already given this statement. FBIA members caution the committee from making strong recommendations. Another trade organization has urged the committee to discontinue using the term ultra-processed until there is consensus on an evidence-based definition. I'm not going to tell you what to eat or even how to eat, but I think it's a reasonable expectation for anyone to have access to good scientific information, to have dietary guidelines that reflect evidence rather than industry funding. Ultimately, this is a first step in a long process. One of the first studies linking tobacco to cancer was done in 1950. It wasn't until 1998 that the tobacco companies conceded and struck a deal to pay states for the medical damage they'd done and stop their aggressive and deceptive marketing practices. If we don't start now, we won't get another chance to set the record straight until 2029.
Very interesting. And in the guideline space, Nina Teicholz, who wrote the book, The Big Fat Surprise, about the lack of data for the low-fat diet, and took Gary Taubes' Good Calories, Bad Calories, amazing book on every reader's list if you want to get into this. Good Calories, Bad Calories, Gary Taubes. The Big Fat Surprise, Nina Teicholz. Nina stayed in the game, so to speak, by creating the Nutrition Coalition. And she's been critical of the guideline, just like this gentleman, the guideline process and all that. At a recent meeting, I asked Nina Teicholz, why we even have a dietary guideline at all. You know, there was a time when there wasn't a dietary guideline, and the guidelines influence what can be done in schools, in nursing homes, in hospitals. Her response kind of surprised me. She said, well, it's been so distorted and so bad for so long. We need a guideline to tell people really what to eat, and that is scientifically based. I thought that was a reasonable response, but there doesn't have to be a guideline, especially if it's totally influenced and lobbied to be so because of the companies, and their influence has been very strong throughout the years in the US national dietary guidelines. A provocative video here. I think the correlation or metaphor, very interesting video here, and I think the comparison of the tobacco story with the ultra-processed sugar and starches and ultra-processed food story is very similar. I don't know if the end game is to do what the attorneys general did for tobacco, to sue and to make amends and make people pay for it. I think some science needs to be done to directly implicate the ultra-processed foods, and that would not be hard to do. You randomize people to eating sugar or not having sugar, see what happens to their blood sugars and their diabetes and their obesity. Actually, you know, that study's never been directly done. Although we've done studies where we tell people not to eat sugar and starches and things get better, but that doesn't mean that it was just the sugar by itself. It's the sugars and starches that we would reduce in one fell swoop. So something in that change is salutary, is beneficial. But I can't say that there's a study really that implicates sugar as the cause of diabetes, actually. And it can be hidden in the context of this ultra-processed food, amorphous, ambiguous term. I hope not. I hope you find this helpful. If you like this, please like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. And look for new content on Wednesdays and Fridays. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.